Hello, Substack followers and community. It's great to be with you this morning. For some of you, afternoon for some of you, and well in the middle of the night for the rest of the world. And I'm here in California on a lunch break and just wanted to take some time here to talk to you in the Substack community world who have recently joined my particular part of Substack and also who recently resonated with an article I wrote on Substack based on my perspective as a US citizen raised in Venezuela in the 80s and 90s. And I am hoping that in this conversation, we can take a bit of an angle that I believe is really important right now, but also to continue to focus us and perspective in a perspective that is really needed right now, and that is to center the Venezuelan voices themselves. And so we'll be discussing some of that and also some of the leadership lessons in particular we can learn from Venezuela right now. I think that's really one of the biggest values of listening to Venezuelans right now is we could all use their perspective of lived experience, visceral, embodied over the last 27 years of leadership that's not just in the political sense, but across business and education sector and across industries, which on a World of Difference podcast, that's what we explore is leadership across industries and making sure that's values driven and authentic. And we're seeing less and less of that in spaces that we want to see these days. So welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining. I know a few more people are going to join, but we're going to go ahead and get started. This video will be available later. But I really want to talk today about when leadership fails and what Venezuela really teaches us about the cost of loyalty over competence. And whether you've worked in business or academia or politics, you've probably had at least some experience with somebody who really preferred to have loyalists work for them, whether that meant you can't question them as a leader because of their insecurities or their need to dominate and consolidate power or abuse their power. And so today I really want to talk about something that it just keeps me up at night, to be honest. I am a very values driven leader. I keep my values here on my desk. One of my top leadership values as a person is challenge. I love a good challenge. I love when people challenge me. I have my own personal board of directors, and I love to take on roles where I can, tackle a challenge. And so today, I think that one of the biggest challenges the world is facing, and Venezuelans in particular, and the US is now very much involved in very particular ways, is the situation there. But I think the people that are most affected by decisions that are being made should be the ones most centered in the conversation. All that being said, we need a diversity of voices around the table to discuss how to move forward in ways that are as complicated as what's happening in Venezuela. But the voices we must listen to who are not a monolith are the Venezuelans themselves. So I want to talk to you today about this that keeps me up at night, not just as somebody who grew up in Venezuela, but as somebody who works with leaders every day here in Silicon Valley. What happened in Venezuela over the past 27 years, it's not just a cautionary tale about one dictator or one failed regime. It really is a masterclass in what happens when leaders really abandon human-centered values driven leadership in favor of loyalty, control, or personal profit, or all of the above. And so, right now, we're watching those same patterns play out really on a world stage, aren't we? We have suddenly Greenland is in the conversation again. And I just flew over Greenland in March. And as I was flying over it on my way to Denmark, the London Heathrow fire broke out. And we had to turn back to go to Washington, D.C., and it took us days to eventually get there. When we got to Denmark, and this was in the spring, they said, wow, as a U.S. citizen, you're not afraid to be traveling here because of all that's going on with, Trump threatening to take over Greenland. And now that's back in the conversation. This is definitely a global conversation, but I must emphasize, listening to Venezuelans themselves, I'm not seeing it happen in ways that it should be. And it's not surprising because people want to center themselves in the situation. Various countries where Venezuelans are part of the diaspora living there, and that's 8 million of them who are in exile, everywhere from Colombia to Peru to the United States to Spain to Chile and all types of other places where they have had to flee, not because they don't love their country, but to survive. And so, yes, this is a global conversation. I know that this is trauma triggering for a lot of people because we've seen this before in various situations, but certainly Venezuelans have seen this before. And they are some of the best teachers we have on what it means to adapt without surrendering and survive with impossible choices that they've had to make and are continuing to have to make, knowing that they are pawns on a chessboard between political figures who are playing with their lives. So I want to talk about the leadership that broke a nation and what we can learn from Venezuelans. So I want to take us back to 2003. Hugo Chavez made a decision that would fundamentally alter Venezuela's trajectory for generations. And that is PDVSA, which is Petróleos de Venezuela. If you're English speaker, it's PDVSA. You may have seen that. You may have seen some flags on, things in the news recently about that. But PDVSA, it wasn't just an oil company in Venezuela. It was really the pride of the nation when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. So Venezuela holds to this day the largest proven oil reserves on earth. OPEC itself was begun in Venezuela by a Venezuelan, Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. He studied at Johns Hopkins University. He was in the ministry and minister level in Venezuela. Brilliant. There's a book out there that he wrote. He passed away in Washington, D.C. in the late 70s, but he founded OPEC and as a Venezuelan. And so Venezuela, it holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, estimated at over 300 billion barrels, accounting for roughly 17 to 20% of global totals, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Canada. However, production has been hampered by underinvestment and the sanctions from the US, meaning it contributes a much smaller percentage to the actual world output compared to its reserve dominance. And most of the oil from Venezuela is difficult to extract, heavy crude oil in the Orinoco Belt region of Venezuela. But when I was growing up, Venezuela was a model democracy. The best university in South America was in Caracas. Venezuela produced some of the most brilliant petroleum engineers and technical experts in the world. And they weren't just employees of PDVSA when in 2003, Chavez made these changes. They were Venezuelan intellectual capital. And they were specifically trained to steward the resource that could have made Venezuela flourish for generations to come. However, in 2003, Chavez purged them. 18,000 technical experts, engineers, geologists, managers who actually knew how to run a very complex oil operation were fired and replaced with political loyalists. So instead of expertise, it was those who don't question and who just obey and capitulate and follow. So the Venezuelan National General Strike of 2002 and 2003 was an attempt by the Venezuelan opposition against President Hugo Chavez to summon a new presidential election. It took place between December 2002 and February 2003 when it finally faded, the strike. The government then fired around 18,000 PDVSA employees, and arrest warrants were issued for the presidents of the striking organizations. So the main impact of that strike derived from the stoppage of the oil industry, in particular the state-run PDVSA, which provides a majority of Venezuelan export revenue. So the strike was preceded by also, many of you may have read this recently in the news, the 2002 coup d'etat attempt in April 2002, which the U.S. seems to have been involved in on a certain level. Once again, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, a couple of coup attempts back during that time. In fact, Hugo Chavez himself led a coup attempt in November 1992. And, we woke up and saw him on the TV station. What he did was he killed a couple of TV station employees and said, "I'm now the leader of this nation," which, if you know the tyrant playbook, taking over the media is an early step. And incidentally, he got arrested. He hadn't actually taken over the government, just the TV stations. But it gave him his moment of being seen and fame and wearing military fatigues as he did this because it was from within the military. He was arrested, put in prison, and then when he got out, he ran for president in 1999 and he won. So the Venezuela elected a felon. If you're seeing the patterns, you're not wrong. There's a playbook here, and this is part of why we need to listen to Venezuelans if you're a U.S. citizen in particular right now, instead of focusing on our frameworks of Democrat and Republican or MAGA or not or whatever. There's even Venezuelans who are now U.S. citizens who are very MAGA in Florida and other places, and it's all very, very complicated. But if we only look at it through the frameworks and the ideologies, we're going to miss so much because there's history, there's nuance, and there's certainly this huge opportunity for us to express empathy for Venezuelans and what they've gone through. as well as the grief and loss that they're experiencing. So I want us to focus on us from a leadership perspective, because that's a lot of what I unpack here on Substack and at A World of Difference podcast. From a leadership perspective, I want us to be clear, and I want to be crystal clear about what this decision represents that Chavez made. Chavez chose loyalty over competence, and he chose control over capability, and he chose short-term political power over long-term institutional health. And so this is what happens when a leader views expertise as a threat instead of as an asset. Have you been around those kinds of leaders where they felt like your expertise was outshining them and then you had to die? They had to get rid of you because of insecurities or ego or maybe some narcissism, various reasons. But that is leadership that doesn't go well in the long term. And so when knowledge becomes dangerous, and because it might challenge authority or question a leader who wants to be unquestionable, when technical truth becomes inconvenient to the narrative you're trying to build, this is the end result. So really, let's talk about the cascading cost of what happened, even just from that particular moment in history until now. So what happened next isn't exactly what happens in every organization, but you're going to see similar versions of it across industries. So whether it's a nation, a Fortune 500 company, or a startup, when you systematically move and remove people who actually know how to do the work outside of the organization, whether it's through a mass layoff where particular people are chosen, or firings, or making people so miserable they'll quit. There's various versions of this and across industries. But whenever you systematically remove people who know how to do the work, it is a ticking time bomb. The infrastructure, obviously, in Venezuela, as a result of this, began to decay. Not overnight, but certainly steadily, predictably. And so refineries that once operated with precision began to really break down. Production dropped significantly from the late 90s when it was at its height. I think around like over 3 million barrels a day, I think is what the number is. And now it's down to 1 million. It's a third or less. So investment dried up as well, because why would you invest in expertise when expertise has been defined as disloyalty? So it's bad for business. And here's what breaks my heart. As someone who studies leadership and organizational effectiveness, all of that brilliant talent didn't disappear from Venezuela, just like it wouldn't disappear from your corporation if you started to oust people who question. Those petroleum engineers, those technical experts that trained at the best universities in South America, they just had to go somewhere else to use their gifts. So if you're following Venezuelan American journalist here on Substack, Mariana Atencio, and I hope that you do, she's an excellent writer and speaker and really covering the news with a lot of nuance, from trying to bring all the perspectives, but centering the perspectives of many Venezuelans and her own. She wrote here on Substack recently, and I hope you check out that article. She wrote about her younger brother who studied business and specialized in oil and gas because he believed that Venezuela could be something even greater than what it was. And he never really got to work in the industry that he trained for at home. So like hundreds of thousands of others, he fled and he had to build his career abroad, first in Colombia and now in Canada. And, the dream for so many is that they will eventually get to go back and flourish and fulfill the dream they have of rebuilding Venezuela and helping her flourish again to the status that she was and beyond. But multiply his story by thousands, right? I mean, 8 million Venezuelans in the diaspora and exile, many of whom have not been able to return because of the difficulties in the paperwork and the bureaucracy once you have left, being considered not a loyalist anymore. Not for lack of love for the country, for the most part, but largely because this was a situation where to survive, hard decisions had to be made, including, for many, walking across the Darien Gap into the United States to survive. And many of them don't survive the Darien Gap portion of the journey, which is early on in the journey. As people are crossing from Venezuela to Colombia and into Panama, that's when they start to get into the Darien Gap region. And 90% of people, men and women, are sexually assaulted in that area. There are many who don't survive. It's a very difficult journey. No one would do that unless they were absolutely desperate to survive. And then when they arrive here, they're also often not feeling free to express any disloyalty or to question a leader, not only because that's been their lived experience from where they came from, and their nervous systems have been primed for that through a lot of trauma. And we've got the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. Fawn response being one of the favorites of tyrannical leaders who don't like to be questioned. So all of those are very hard choices to make of when and how to speak out. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But multiply the story of this brother of Mariana Atencio that she's been writing about and his desire to live his dream in Venezuela, and multiply that by thousands. Many aren't leaving to pursue necessarily a different dream. Like many US citizens would often believe that everybody's coming here to pursue an American dream. That's not always exactly how it is. This is an issue in many cases of just survival and hoping that one day they can return to a place that actually is not only survivable, but thrivable. Um, so that's what poor leadership costs. The cost is enormous. It's more than the invoice of the oil being handed to people that we just rescued from drowning. And all that to say, somebody needed to go in and help rescue the Venezuelan people from this man because they had tried everything humanly possible within democracy, banging pots and pans over the years. Electing Edmundo Gonzalez last summer, who's still not been given the chance to be the president, and Maria Corina Machado, who got the Nobel Peace Prize recently, but was unable to make her initial ceremony because she's been in hiding for her life, at risk from Maduro's threats to her. She was not allowed to run for president, but she was largely responsible for helping Edmundo Gonzalez win the election, but it wasn't recognized as a win by Nicolas Maduro. So the US didn't go in and actually take out a sitting president. Nicolas Maduro was not elected president, and he was reigning as one. So there's a lot of debate over whether this is actually a sovereign nation at this point. I don't really want to get into that so much, but I do want to say the helping someone and going to rescue, breaking international laws, yes, that happened. Geneva Convention, the UN Charter on Force, all of these things are systems in place that we must reckon with, not only because safety matters and laws matter, but we have to reckon with what happens when this doesn't work for people like Venezuelans who for 27 years have been pleading for people to help because they've done everything they could. They're exhausted. Are they some of the most resilient people in the world? Yes. And that's why listening to them is a chance for us to learn what it means to adapt without surrendering, how to survive these unsurvivable circumstances. They are incredibly resilient, but at the cost of the now exhaustion that they are expressing. They need some relief, some rest, and a collective trauma that they're experiencing again and again, a complex trauma where the one that's hurting them has been hurting them again and again and disappearing people. And even now that the head of the Hydra has been cut off by the US bombing Caracas and ousting Maduro, is, Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president, is now in charge. And this is just another head of the Hydra. So Chavez would have been one. And then when he died and recommended Nicolas Maduro be the president, it was a very loyalist bus driver. And then Nicolas became president, but it's very contested every election he's ever won. That's something to really understand about the Venezuelan history is the elections haven't been free and fair for the entirety of Nicolas Maduro's regime. And so he was not a sitting president, but he was ruling. And then he was probably the second head of this Hydra that would have been Chavez, him, and now Delcy Rodriguez, whose brother is also high up in the government. So a lot of history there. Her dad was killed in a movement to change things in the Venezuelan government. She grew up in a very political family. She's known to be very Machiavellian and really has become wealthy off the Venezuelan people, as well as Nicolas Maduro. And so profiting off of the oil while the Venezuelan people themselves were not seeing those profits. Iran, China, Russia, Cuba, they've all been involved in a version of colonizing Venezuela during this time when the world was debating ideologies. And in the US, it was about Republican or Democrat. And in the meantime, people who were dying for rescue and waving their hands in an ocean saying, please save us. And finally, the US, at least the president of the US made a decision to go in and with a boat and take this man out, or so to metaphorically speaking, rescue Venezuelans from this dictator, this tyrant who was torturing his own people. And I think that the debate around the ideologies of that is important, but what's most center the voices of Venezuelans who need an empathetic witness right now, just like anyone walking through complex trauma does. And they're grieving. They're grieving their loved ones that protested over the years, 27 years, that got out and banged their pots and pans. They're grieving over their loved ones who died in their arms when there wasn't medicine in the hospital, when Cuban doctors were brought in, but they were really spies. And they're really the ones guarding Hugo Chavez and Maduro. You'll notice in the raids that the U.S. did on the night of the 2nd, early morning of the 3rd, is that a lot of Cubans died because Chavez and Maduro only trusted Cubans to be the ones surrounding them and guarding them. And so, some Venezuelans are saying things that you would expect people who've been traumatized and have cried out for help when no one was listening for 27 years and debating their ideologies over coffee instead of really helping them. A lot of what we're hearing is an imagination that can't go as far as them believing they can flourish free and independently and with sovereignty without help. And there's some truth there. And at the same time, we often see people lose their ability to completely hope in a direction that is fully free when they've been so repressed and so harmed. And it's something, if we haven't lived it, and I personally haven't lived through what they've lived through, both as a US citizen with a US passport, even when I grew up there, but also not living there during these most intense years of the regime. But keeping up with my Venezuelan friends for sure, checking in with them now, experiencing all the hypervigilance myself, and making sure I'm checking in with my Aura ring because, yes, I've been very stressed ever since the night of the 2nd, and I'm trying to care for myself. But also, Venezuelans are times 1,000 over this because it's so much more on the line for them. And lives are at stake even now, where Delcy Rodriguez has now ordered in Venezuela where they're stopping people at checkpoints and they check their phones. And if they have posted anything in favor of Trump ousting Maduro, then they can be detained. So they're not, I would never ask my Venezuelan friends who are still there to speak into any of that because it would put them at risk. And they won't, because that's how they've survived. And so that capitulation has been a way to adapt and not surrender while still trying to figure out how to move forward and dream. So many Venezuelans, what I'm hearing them express is they don't necessarily want to talk about the oil. They understand it. The oil hasn't been theirs for a long time. It's been taken by so many others. And yes, it is a power grab by Trump, and he's trying to grab the oil, and he's not even pretending that he's not. And he's certainly working with Delcy Rodriguez to make some sort of art of the deal with her to make sure he gets what he wants. And it's very transactional. And what I'm hearing from a lot of Venezuelans is they understand that. And it's as though we rescued them drowning in an ocean. And you don't ask when someone's trying to rescue you what party they're from or what country they're from. You're just grateful for the rescue. And being handed an invoice to pay for your own rescue at the price of oil from your lands, to me as a US citizen, is a special kind of nefarious. And I have a huge beef with Donald Trump for that play and for all of our government for allowing it to happen. And as a US citizen, I'm doing my best to hold my government accountable. And at the same time, it seems as though because of maybe the years of trauma, the years of crying out and no one listening, no one caring, discussing the ideologies over coffee, but not really bothering to drive a boat by and help rescue Venezuelans, that at this point, it's as if they are willing to say, sure, take our oil because it was never ours for a long time anyway. It's been benefiting other countries like Iran, China, Russia, Cuba. But I do hope that we can get to the point where Venezuelans really do benefit from that oil. They deserve that. That's their land. It's not ours. And even though Trump has said in his press conference that he's going to help benefit the Venezuelan people, there's zero transparency out of that. And it's a lot more complicated than probably he realizes, just based on how we've seen him make decisions in the past. But when I think about the many in the diaspora, the top talent of Venezuela, it's had to flee to survive and what that leadership costs, it's not just one generation's dreams that have died, but it's an entire nation's, capacity to function that this poor leadership really, led to. And so the pattern we're watching now I wanted to talk about what's happening now because this isn't just history; it's present tense. It's happening now. Every 24 hours, things are different. And so when President Trump announced, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and he was in Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by these identical blue-suited men, not a single woman present, by the way, in that night in Mar-a-Lago where they were watching the raid take place, the operation, as they call it. But he did say the quiet part out loud a few hours later on the 3rd when he did his press conference. We'll be getting all that money. And it was about oil. It wasn't about democracy. This isn't really a Cold War situation like what I grew up with in South America was the Cold War. And so when I was in my international school, growing up there, we found out that the U.S. had invaded Panama and ousted President Manuel Noriega. And that was more of a Cold War situation where it was more about democracy and communism back in that time. All that being said, my school bus driver, Joni, was always grilling me and trying to get me to defend how the U.S. could invade Panama and oust their leader. And I never wanted to defend it. I didn't believe it was right. It seemed all kinds of wrong to me. And yet it's very similar. If you look back at the pictures, which some of them have posted them recently, of the capture of President Manuel Noriega from Panama back in 1989, and you see the pictures of the capture of Nicolas Maduro on early morning January 3rd, they're very similar. And it's a lot of political theater. There's a lot, conversation around drug trafficking, pretty similar. But there's so much more behind it than just that. It's once again, it's a lot of it is a show. It's a lot of media, and it's important to understand there's a lot of history and nuance there. So when President Trump announced this in Mar-a-Lago with all these men, one of the things that I often think about when I see a decision being made to go to war, to do a military operation, or to even have peace talks, when there's not a single woman at the table, it feels almost really intentional that you don't have any desire for peace. Because we know, statistically speaking, that when women are involved in peacemaking, the chances of it succeeding and for lasting years highly increases by having women at the table. And not a single woman being present that night in Mar-a-Lago, and even Pete Hegseth's comment that it was our military men that did this operation. And we know how Pete Hegseth has been very much, pro ousting women from the military. It all seemed very intentional that this was a very, I would say, toxic masculinity version of that. And we could debate all of that as well. But at the end of the day, Venezuelans have suffered enough. It's odd because now we have the first woman president in Venezuela, and it doesn't feel as though we can celebrate it because she's a terrible leader who's tortured her own people, who has both capitulated with the Nicolas Maduro's regime and previously with Chavez as well, but also is now some version of capitulation with Trump, if that's the way they're trying to work it out behind the scenes. And so that just means that at the end of the day, the average Venezuelan suffers again and again and again. And so this transactional leadership that we're seeing both from the side of Donald Trump, Nicolas Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez, and all the other political players involved, from Putin and Russia and to, China, Iran, Cuba, there's all these leaders that are playing this game of chess, and the Venezuelan people are the pawns on the chessboard. And so this transactional leadership is just completely exposed. And so I need you to understand something. Transactional leadership always decenters humans, always, in favor of what can be extracted, what can be gained, and what serves the leader's interests. And we can see this across religion, politics, business, academia. You may have been in a mega church where your pastor acted this way. You may have seen your political leader act this way, or your CEO or vice president of your educational company. Any leader could be this way, and humans are the ones that get decentered so that the leader can gain something at their expense. And so, Trump talks about Venezuela's oil the way Chavez talked about PDVSA, as a resource to control, to reimburse costs to a select group that will benefit, not as something that belongs to the Venezuelan people themselves. So not as something that could build a thriving society if managed with integrity and competence, the way the Venezuelan people finally deserve after all these decades. Different leaders, different ideologies, supposedly, but the same fundamental failure, these two, right? Treating people and their resources as things rather than communities to be served that deserve to flourish. So, what does human centered leadership actually look like? Well, we've unpacked that quite a bit on a World of Difference podcast, but let me tell you what values driven, human centered leadership would have looked like both then and now. In 2003, instead of purging technical experts like Chavez did, a human centered leader would have asked, how do we harness this incredible expertise while also ensuring it serves all Venezuelans and not just an elite few? At this point, it's 90% poverty and 10% outside of poverty. And within the 90% experiencing poverty in Venezuela, a significant portion of abject poverty, where the current minimum wage is $3 US. It's unsurvivable in almost every way. That leader, who would have been human centered in 2003, had we had one in Venezuela, would have invested in transparency and accountability structures and training the next generation of experts. They would have built systems with technical expertise and excellence and social responsibility, reinforcing each other instead of competing against one another. In 2026, a human centered approach to Venezuela's crisis would have centered Venezuelan voices on our news sources here in the United States. Have you seen a Venezuelan speaking on a microphone, or is it just US white men or white people or people who are representing the Democratic Party or people who are representing the Republicans and viewing it only through our frameworks? We can do that, and we should do that to a certain extent, but not at the expense of hearing from the Venezuelans themselves who are most affected by all these decisions. Particularly Maria Corina Machado, who's the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who helped Edmundo Gonzalez get elected, who was the man the US president last summer recognized as the one who won the election. And yet Trump, when he did his presidential briefing on the 3rd after the operation in the early morning hours, everyone sort of expected him to say, and now we recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the president, or say Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, because she not only won the Nobel Peace Prize, but she largely helped Edmundo Gonzalez, win through her efforts and was not allowed to run for president and has been still in hiding in exile in order to save her life from the threats of Maduro and his regime, which is still in place. But Trump did not recognize her or Edmundo Gonzalez. In fact, he only mentioned it when somebody asked him a question at the end. And he said Maria Corina Machado did not have the influence or the support to lead Venezuelans. Factually incorrect, because she has a significant amount of support. Also ironic, because his approval rating was only around 30%, of course, bumped up to 40%, as it does apparently in history here in the United States when a leader of our nation and sitting in the White House tends to invade another country or do a military operation, their approval rating tends to go up. So I think you got to bump up to like 40%. But how ironic for him to say she didn't have the support when in fact she does. And not for him to decide that. All kinds of wrong as a US citizen that I have with that. But a human-centered leader would have asked Venezuelans what they need. It would have involved the UN, the Organization of American States, regional partners who understand the complexity of Venezuela, and sitting and asking Venezuelans, what do you need? How can we support your vision for your country? These are elements I learned in the Philippines when I went to get in a certification program for community development, where Filipinos taught us how to be in a village and ask the village leaders what they need and really listen to understand their needs before coming in and imposing aid relief that wasn't going to help them. And here we are again saying, this is what you need. It's something we should have learned from colonization. Apparently we have not. Instead, what we heard was, we'll run the country. Trump feels that he can run the country, struggling to run his own, and we'll be reimbursed from the oil. So as if he needs more salary. I don't know. There's no transparency on where this money is going to go, but we do know Trump has had a tendency to line his own pockets, even in our own nation. The talent that Venezuela lost is just one of many things to consider in this whole history. But I want you to sit with this for a moment. Venezuela had everything. Natural resources, in addition to the largest oil reserves in the world, gold, diamonds. My wedding ring is gold from Venezuela. Elements that we have here in Silicon Valley that we use for our technology, from phones to all kinds of other things. Very resource rich nation in addition to oil. Beauty that you can't imagine, the tallest waterfall in the world, Angel Falls, the Amazon, the Morrocoy National Park, my favorite place in the whole world, on the islands there in the Caribbean, sand dunes, tall Andes Mountains with snow on the top of Pico Bolivar. And at the time when I was growing up, the highest cable car ride in the world. Gorgeous. Venezuela, in terms of beauty, is unmatched. And yet, all of this has devastated this nation over the years. The university that produced the world-class petroleum engineers, the institutional knowledge to be an energy titan that would have lifted millions out of poverty. And because of leadership failures, not ideologies, but leadership failures, first choosing loyalty over competence, and then choosing extraction over development. An entire generation of brilliant minds had to leave to survive. They're engineers in Canada now, business leaders in Colombia, experts scattered across the world, carrying the dream of what Venezuela could have been and could be, and what it still could be if leadership ever centered humans over power. And it's not as much of a brain drain as it is a leadership failure made visible in the human lives that are expressing the reality of what happened. So what does this mean for all of us? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Lori, I don't run a country. I'm not responsible for oil policy. Why does this matter to me? And here's why. The patterns that destroyed Venezuela's institutions exist in organizations everywhere. Every time a leader chooses loyalty over competence in their hiring decisions, every time technical expertise is dismissed because it challenges a preferred narrative, every time short-term wins are prioritized over long-term institutional health, every time people are treated as resources more than people who generate them and give them ideas. These aren't just political failures. These are leadership failures. And they scale from teams to companies to nations. And so the questions I think we should be asking, and that I'm asking, I'm sitting with these, and I invite you to sit with them too. In your organization, are you hiring for competence and values alignment, or for loyalty and compliance? People who capitulate, people who fawn. What experts bring you information that challenges your plans? Do you listen or do you replace them? Are you building systems that can outlast you? Or are you building systems that only work if you maintain control? When you make decisions about resources, whether it's budget, talent, or opportunity, who actually benefits from those decisions? Is it the people closest to the work or the people closest to the power? Are you willing to share power with people who might do things differently than you would? These aren't abstract questions right now. These answers determine whether organizations thrive or collapse slowly over time, whether nations flourish or whether they fracture. What does Venezuela deserve? Let me be clear about something. I am dancing and celebrating that Maduro has been removed, along with many Venezuelans, regardless of their political views. That regime caused unspeakable suffering. And if you don't know about that, please go and listen to Venezuelans. Their stories need to be heard. And I think one of the greatest honors is to bear witness with them as they share the many stories they all have. My Venezuelan friends and family have been waiting for this moment for years, for decades, actually. And I am terrified about what comes next. And many of them are worried and terrified because removing one bad leader doesn't fix systems that are allowed to consolidate power in the first place. Venezuela needs what it's always needed: leadership that serves Venezuelans, not leadership that extracts from them. Venezuela needs its scattered talent to come home and rebuild. And that's what many of them long to do, to have grandchildren meet their grandparents. I want to take my kids to see the beaches I grew up on in the islands and meet my friends I went to Sunday school class with under the mango tree. My friends from my international school, some of them who stayed, and my Sunday school teachers, my neighbors. I want my kids to meet them. And yet, it also needs investment in people, not just infrastructure. It needs transparency and accountability from their side and from the US side and all of us. Not a new strongman that's making deals in back rooms with President Trump and oil company presidents like Cisco, who made a big deal recently in December that had been a months-long process. It's not okay that oil company presidents know more about what's going on with Trump's plans in Venezuela than our government officials do. Venezuela needs what every organization needs: leaders who believe human flourishing is the point, not a pleasant side effect if money is left over. So the leadership choice that we have right now is pretty intense. What I know after decades of studying leadership, working with leaders across 6 continents, and watching my homeland navigate crisis after crisis, values-driven, human-centered leadership is not naive. It's not soft. It's not idealistic dreaming. It's the only thing that works long-term. The only thing. And when you build organizations and systems that develop people's capacities, that center their dignity, that distribute power and resources equitably, you build something robust and sustainable, something resilient, something that can weather storms and adapt to all kinds of change. When you build systems that concentrate power, however, that prioritize loyalty over competence, that extract value for a few at the expense of many, you might succeed spectacularly in the short term. You might even look like a genius temporarily, but eventually reality catches up. And that infrastructure breaks down, the talent leaves, the people who've been decentered find ways to resist, to leave, to stop cooperating with their own oppression. So in closing, I just want to say that Venezuela is teaching us in real time what the stakes are when leadership fails. 27 years of choosing loyalty over competence, of treating expertise as a threat, of viewing oil reserves as something to control rather than a trust to steward for future generations. The cost? 8 million people in diaspora and exile, families separated for decades, children who've never met their grandparents, brilliant engineers working anywhere but their home, and a nation that should have flourished struggling to survive. And now we're watching world leaders on a global stage make the same fundamental errors, treating Venezuela's crisis as a business opportunity, centering oil over people, talking about running a country like it's a corporate acquisition and they've ousted the CEO and they're bringing in the vice president. This is what happens when leadership is transactional rather than transformational, when humans become resources to extract rather than people to serve. We can do better. We must do better because the Venezuelan people, the ones who stayed and survived, the ones scattered across the world, holding on to hope, the brilliant minds who never got to build the country they studied in, that they wanted to serve, they deserve leadership that actually centers them. And so do your teams, your organizations, your communities, and so do we all. Thank you for listening. And please, if you know a Venezuelan today, ask them how they're doing. Really ask. And sit there with empathy, not judgment, just to understand and to feel what they're feeling and to cry with them, celebrate with them, dance with them. They're feeling all the feels: afraid, worried, happy, hopeful, probably hypervigilant. And then ask yourself, what kind of a leader am I becoming? What systems am I building? Who am I centering? And who am I leaving out? Those answers matter more than we know. Thank you so much for joining today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in or message me later here on Substack or LinkedIn, or reaching out to me through my personal website. I would love for you to listen to A World of Difference podcast. And I also have a podcast interview that'll be coming out very soon with Corey Nathan, who's also here on Substack, who hosts the podcast Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. He's a dear friend. I've been on the show several times now, and we've spoken together at podcast conferences, had Thai food here nearby me in Santa Cruz. He's also Californian. So that episode will be coming out soon where he asked me questions as to understand from my perspective what's going on in Venezuela. So look for that. And if you have any reactions or questions or thoughts, please let me know. Once again, I'm Lori Adams Brown, and you can find me at loriadamsbrown.com. Listen to a World of Difference podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If this resonated with you, please share it with a leader who needs to hear it. And if you're Venezuelan, te veo. I see you. Your hope and your pain matter so deeply to me. And I share a fraction of it as somebody who grew up there and loves this land so, so very much. The world is finally watching. And let's make sure they keep listening to your voices and not just talking about you. Gracias, and thank you to everyone.